Now let's welcome Steve Orleans, the President at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, to moderate the Ambassador Dialogue.
2, 3. Now you can hear me. Okay, everybody.
I want to move forward on, but there wasn't a lot decided. Yeah, there wasn't a lot.
American infrastructure being what it is, though this could happen in China, and we don't have a high-speed rail between Boston and Chicago, which I wish we did. Ambassador Chin is late, so his plane, I think, has landed. If somebody can tell me how long it takes to get from O'Hare here, we can know when he will arrive. But we've got, if everybody could be seated, we have got 2 ambassadors who have had incredibly illustrious political careers before they became ambassador. So actually my first question relates, I didn't tell you in advance, there's one question I just need to ask, which I've always wanted to know. Here you've had, Terry, you were the longest serving governor in the history of Iowa. Max, you were the longest serving senator in the history of Montana. Do I call you ambassador, or do I call you governor, or do I call you senator, or do I call you ambassador? I've never quite figured out which is
Most
more
Iowans
senior.
still call me governor, but ambassador is probably more correct. But doesn't matter. I answer to whatever.
Max?
I've been called everything, so whatever works.
Whatever works. Well, I'll, since I know you both so well, I'll call you Terry and Max. But
I prefer that.
So in the absence of Qinggong, we'll start, and then when he arrives, I'll do some rapid fire questions for Qinggong. But obviously, you both served as ambassador for 3+ years. Just tell us the situation has changed somewhat, but tell us what was the highlight and lowlight of your time of service. Terry, you kick it off.
Well, in terms of the highlight, I guess it was reaching the agreement on the Phase 1 trade agreement. That was a long, hard battle to get that. That was very significant, and it made a real difference. It's not been perfect, but it has been a big improvement. In terms of the low light, I gotta say the fact that COVID-19 started in Wuhan when I was the ambassador, and obviously that became a worldwide pandemic.
Let me ask you a substantive question. With Phase 1, has China implemented that the way you thought it would be implemented?
Well, not perfectly, but there's been record purchases of agriculture products. There's been improvements in protecting things like intellectual property. There's been improvements for opportunities for insurance and financial services. And so, yeah, there's been progress made, but it's not been perfect. For instance, I come from an agricultural state, and they've still not taken the action that was agreed upon in Phase 1 for ethanol and for DDGs. But we're still hopeful that more of those things can be resolved. And one of the big issues, of course, is our tariffs and their retaliatory tariffs and the impact that that's had on trade.
Tariffs were imposed when you were ambassador to China.
And it did get their attention. I think in one sense, I'm not sure we would have gotten a Trade 1 agreement without the tariffs. It's certainly not something that I liked, but it happened, and it continues to exist.
Should we end them?
I would like to see us do so in a reciprocal way, so in the way the Chinese usually operate is reciprocity. For instance, one of the lowlights too was the closing of the consulates in Houston and then in Chengdu.
Yep.
And I told the Secretary of State, if we close their consulate, they'll close one of ours. And they did, and they chose Chengdu because it was comparable in size.
I'll go to Max in 1 second, but I can't help but ask, should we reopen them reciprocally?
Well, that's a challenge, I think. a lot of people feel that, it would be nice to have another consulate. I'm not sure Chengdu is the right location, or we could go back to the facility that we had. So it'd probably have to be a different location for the consulate. But consulates are important. They serve a very important purpose, and one of the things they do is visas. And, obviously COVID's had a big impact on that too. Dramatically reduced the number of visas, and especially student visas and things like that. And I think that's one of the good things in the relationship has been the subnational things like sister states and sister cities and students attending colleges and universities. At one time we had probably 360,000 Chinese students studying here in the United States, more than any other country.
Max, highlights and lowlights. The highlight and lowlight.
Well, there's several high. One is the Chinese people. I found Chinese people to be more candid, more interested in honest conversations than Americans. And I loved it. You could engage a Chinese person on each subject, they tell you what they think, and not in a negative way, but just in a factual way is what's going on. And I like the upbeat optimism that I find more among Chinese people, middle class at least, than compared with Americans. Second, just the diversity of the country. I traveled through all the provinces, way out Xinjiang, down South Yunnan and Guilin and Hardin, up all around, and I loved the diversity of the country. Reminded me a lot of America because we're so diverse and geographically in so many ways. Another highlight for me was the U.S. and President Xi and President Obama agreed to a climate agreement. We entered the Paris Accords. It was wonderful. When I started out talking to the Chinese, President Xi and others, and it's like talking to a Fed spokesman. I got nowhere, nothing. And after a while, I see a little glimmer of light. It wasn't just me, but Secretary Kerry come over, Vice President come over, and we just, after a while, you could see the little glimmer in the eyes of the Chinese leadership. And I think essentially it was, hey, this is an opportunity for us, the Chinese, to be on the world stage with the American president. Second, it's an opportunity to develop renewable technologies, solar, wind, and so forth, and clearly the Chinese have, with a vengeance. So those were all highlights, and they're just, I even like stinky tofu, believe it or not. Some people don't, but I do. A disappointment, frankly, was talking with the Chinese about the South China Sea. I could get nowhere. Over and over again, I talked to many, especially one who's head of the program, basically, the southern part of China. I get nowhere. I say, look, other countries have claims, not just China, but so does Vietnam, so does Brunei, Philippines. We got to figure out some way to resolve all this. No, it's ours. South China, all those islands created by dumping sand in the sea, they're ours. That was just a big disappointment. I could not get a discussion going. Earlier program talked about TPP. That's not really a Chinese disappointment. That's an American disappointment. I think that was the most important geopolitical matter to cross my desk, TPP, and so important. I flew back to the United States 2 months before the election. I lobbied, believe it or not, 43 members of Congress, House and Senate, both sides of the aisle. I got nowhere. Donald Trump deep-sixed it. Hillary Clinton deep-sixed it. It was going nowhere. It was a big, big mistake. And it's sad because in the United States, organized labor still has a kind of a veto power over democratic efforts to pass major trade agreements. But in my judgment, I've worked on a lot of trade agreements that they're better, they're good, they're not perfect, and we should try to pass more.
That obviously relates to your perch from the Senate Finance Committee. You had you played a role in WTO accession for China and granting China permanent normal trade relations. Should we And then I'll ask Terry the same question. Should we make a go at CPTPP again? Could you persuade your former colleagues to do it? And then Terry, the question for you, but can you persuade the Republican side to do it?
Well, you've asked two questions. The first is yes. The second is I don't know. Of course we should. Can we be successful? I'm not sure. My view is that this tension between our two countries is one that neither side has the courage, the intelligence, or the gravitas, the desire to address. We're just stuck. And, American administration is stuck, doesn't want to take the efforts that it should undertake. And I can't quite speak for the Chinese, but it seems to be the case here. I think it's a mistake. It's a big mistake. And I think that the time is going to come, maybe a year or two from now, when finally the United States understands, and China too, from the United States perspective, finally understands that China isn't going anywhere. China's always going to be there. It's irrelevant whether it's an autocratic form of government. It's irrelevant whether it's Communist Party is in control. All those things are irrelevant. China's going to be there. China is there. And so we, America, had to figure out a way to deal with China. And trade numbers have been mentioned before, $700 billion, that's part of it. But we just, as a country, have to put aside all of the rhetoric. We have to stop the name calling, both sides. The more the United States criticizes China, the more there will be problems. It's a big mistake for us to do so. And we have to start looking for space where we can finally have honest discussions, public discussions. Remember, the U.S. Senate and the House is not afraid to talk about something constructively about China without fear of having his or her head chopped off. But I blame, and that's too strong a word, I wish the administration would step up more than it has to try to find ways to be more responsible, be more an adult with respect to China. And I wish China would do the same.
Terry, should we? Could we?
Well, I would hope that we could. I've always been a free trader, but I recognize it's a very challenging issue these days. Of course, Max Baucus and my senior senator, Chuck Grassley, are very good friends. They work together on a bipartisan basis on a lot of these issues. We need more of that to try to get things accomplished. Senator Grassley was just reelected to an 8th term, and he's very sharp and he works very hard to represent our state. And we're a state that's very dependent on exports. So, and China is a huge, huge trading partner. They're the second biggest economy in the world, and Americans love the quality and affordability of Chinese goods, and the Chinese people love the safety and the quality of American food. So we have some things that we have in common, and we're interdependent on each other, and we need to find a way to try to work these things out.
Iowa aside, is there a constituency left in the Republican Party to support granting the president authority to negotiate entry into the CPTPP?
No.
Okay.
Sad answer. Wait, who said that?
That was Max that said that, but
you can't answer for the Republicans. He's the Republican.
Well, I'm gonna tell you though, he and Chuck Grassley are pretty close friends, and so I think, and his wife used to be a prosecutor in Des Moines, Iowa, so he has a pretty good knowledge of the situation, and I would concur it's a very difficult situation today. There are still many of us who have built friendships in China. My first year as governor, I signed a sister state agreement with Hebei province. And we have built friendship, which has led to trust, and that has gone a long ways to encouraging exchanges and all of those kind of things that I think can be very helpful. But it's very difficult today, and I think COVID has really hurt this. Not only have we had worldwide a lot of deaths related to COVID, but it's really interrupted travel. And now with China still having significant quarantine, it makes it much more difficult. And those trips and building those relationships, I think, is critically important to the relationship between our two countries.
The last panel was true that Pin moderated was truly magnificent. That, you know, Kerr Gibbs, Dalai Yang, and John Holden are really three of America's greatest experts on China. And they really talked about China in a way that I wish all of America could hear and all of China could hear. It really was fabulous. Now, Max and Terry, you have served in China. Obviously, we've talked about censorship. So let's say CCTV suddenly came to you guys and said, okay, we're going to give you a platform, but it's only a 60-second platform to address the Chinese people. What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is I love the Chinese people. Max has already talked about this, but they have a great work ethic. They're very committed to education to their children, and they're very family oriented, and they treat you very well. In fact, I had the great honor of when I got to China and had a press conference, Xi Jinping saw it, and when I presented my credentials, he said, because my daughter was teaching at the International School of Beijing, and her husband and two granddaughters, he invited my wife and I, my whole family that was in China, to have dinner with him and his wife, Madame Peng, and their 25-year-old daughter. That was really one of the highlights of my time in China, to have that personal.
And your press conference was broadcast in China?
Well, he saw it, so it must have been.
That doesn't mean, I'm not sure, but okay.
There were international media there, and there were Chinese media there, and Xi Jinping, a couple weeks later, when I presented my credentials, said he'd seen it.
All right, but this is uncensored. You're talking to the Chinese people. What do you tell them? Or you love them. What else?
I love the Chinese people, and like Max, I wanted to go to every province and autonomous region in China. I got to 26 of the 31 before COVID shut down travel. But it's a beautiful country, and the people are very friendly, very hospitable, and the sister state of Hebei, I was treated like a rock star when I'd go there, because they knew I was the governor that signed the sister state agreement, which led to all the exchanges and all of the activity over nearly 40 years between our two countries, between that province and the state of Iowa.
Max.
Well, I would do much of the same. Does this work? Much of the same. Tell Chinese how much I love the job, representing the United States in China. Love the job because people are wonderful. We're so dependent upon each other, and people are people. I remember once, I'll try to keep this short, but I was at one of these meetings, S&D, basically U.S. versus one side of the table and China on the other. Secretary Pritzker was leading the American delegation, and Liu He on the other side, and I think Fang Xinghai was over there too. Anyway, it came down to me. I was fourth. Everybody was saying the same thing. Came down just formal talkers. I hated it. It's just reading my talkers. You know, my crack staff gave me these great talkers, but they were just formal talkers. And so finally, I just said I had it. So I just put them aside, and I just said, as I look around this room, about the same size, there are about 200-300 people in this room. I realized nobody in this room has ever run for public office. No one. And I've run 18 times, primaries and generals. And a lot of people give me an earful about what they think. Some like what I do, some don't like what I do. And I've learned two things in all those elections. What's that? Number one, I said that the people are all alike. Chinese people are just like American people. We all have the same hopes, dreams, and desires. We care about decent incomes, food on the table. We care about our kids, education for our kids. We care about addressing pollution, air and water, decent health care. We're the same. People are people. There's no real difference here. You have to remember that. And second, I've learned in all these years that people are pretty smart. They kind of get it after a while. It's the old Abraham Lincoln thing. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all the time. And so when we're here talking about S&ED and this, so on and so forth, let's remember why we're here. We're here for the people we're representing, Americans and the Chinese people. I finished, I couldn't believe it. Everybody on the Chinese side, huge big grins, erupted into spontaneous applause. And I asked myself, I looked at the American side, they had no idea what's going on. And I asked myself, what's going on here? What happened? And I realized later what happened, I was speaking directly to each other, not condescending, not talking down, not lecturing, telling what to do, et cetera. We were just talking about, hey, who we are really. And I think that's an approach that is critical. Americans still tend to be condescending. They still tend to talk down a little bit. That's my experience. And you got to stop that because we're all in this together. People are people. And so what I would say to Chinese people, just that. We Americans, we're people. We have some of the same concerns you have, your kids and grandkids and health and so forth. So let's just keep talking about how we put some of that stuff together.
Let me ask you to put on your policy hats. You know, we have obviously strategic tensions, military tensions, economic tensions, disagreement over each country's treatment of their own citizens. What areas are left for cooperation?
Well, trade is certainly important, and we're interdependent. We American consumers appreciate the quality and affordability of the Chinese products, and the Chinese people appreciate the safety and the quality of American products, especially the food products. So we have that in common. Also, when we get to know each other, much as Max has said, we find we have a lot in common. We care about our families. We have a great work ethic. In many cases, I say the Chinese have a better work ethic than we have. I grew up on a farm and learned to have a good work ethic at an early age, but that's really important. Commitment to education. All of those things we have in common, and that's the reason why I think we can work out a lot of these differences. Obviously we have political systems that are dramatically different, but when you get down to the people care about the same things. They want to have a good quality of life. They want to have good income for their families. They want to have health care. They want the environment to be protected and all of these kinds of things.
Yep.
So those are things that we have in common, and we need to find ways to work out our differences where we can. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. The key is to have the meetings and the conversations. Max and I both participated in the Morfar meeting, which I think this is something that was initiated by.
Explain what it is.
Yeah, Morfar is a group that was started many years ago, I guess, for a conversation between Chinese leaders and American leaders, and Hank Greenberg put this together. And he wants this to help be a catalyst to kind of move us up from which has been a low point in our relationship and improve the opportunities for us to work together.
Max, areas for cooperation.
Well, first, and I said this earlier, we got to stop criticizing each other. Stop it. Stop it. And then that'll open up space. Negative criticism is a closer. It's not an opener. You got to just stop all the name calling back and forth. And some of it's kind of subtle. Second, as stand-up Americans, stand up in deeds as well as words. For example, some think President Biden says he adheres to the one China policy. But on the other hand, there's lots of actions that not only the administration, but some of the Congress take, which kind of push up against the tripwire. So you wonder, is he really believing in one China policy in deeds as well as words? I mean, you got to be honest and direct with what you're doing. So that's. But where is there space? Your prior panel talked. I missed most of it about COVID. Man, if we could find a way to help provide Pfizer and Moderna vaccines and other ways to help China deal with COVID, because my sense is it's going to be a huge problem when China opens up as much as it wants to, because so many people not sufficiently vaccinated, healthcare system, infrastructure, healthcare system in China infrastructure is a little bit deficient. But if we could help, that sends so many positive signals. A, it helps people need help. B, it helps the relationship. And third, the real danger is if China opens up and there's a big explosion of COVID cases, there could be new variants, and we could move more toward a pandemic of a different kind. So it's critical for the United States to do what it can to help China deal with COVID.
That really raises an interesting question. Was the Chinese government wrong in not licensing the production of mRNA vaccines or allowing for the import of those? We don't know. I think Professor Yang talked about it, I think very articulately. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 weeks. This is not 4 years. This is 4 weeks. We're going to see an explosion of COVID cases. What the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations talked about in its healthcare dialogue 6 months ago this was entirely predictable. But one of the ways to mitigate and allow for an opening up was to import, whether it's Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, J&J, just import those and at least vaccinate the over 65 population. I think the three of us are all over 65, but they didn't. Was that wrong?
I think it was wrong, and I think part of the problem has been just China's unwillingness to be very open and candid about the situation. I was the ambassador when COVID started in Wuhan. In fact, it was we were on vacation in New Zealand during the Chinese New Year, which is what a lot of Chinese did as well. And that made it a worldwide pandemic. But I kept hearing from my staff back at the embassy, things are getting worse and you got to get back. They're going to close down. I'm the chief of the mission and I need to be there when we make the decision. And soon we started what they call voluntary departure and then mandatory departure if you had children under 21. We sent 1,300 people back to the United States. And I'm proud to say then, even after we did that, about 20% of the Americans stayed and worked, and we never had a COVID case. And we got a lot of PPE and medical supplies sent to the United States to help when the situation became worse in the United States.
Max, the mRNA, they didn't import it.
Well, it's interesting. When COVID-19 broke, I naively thought, what a great opportunity for the United States president to lend out a hand to China and say, hey, let's figure out how we can help you with the COVID that's developed here, and not call it the Wuhan virus or the Communist Party virus. That was just inane, stupid when we American president did that. So I'm not going to get into whether it's a mistake or not. I am going to get into what do we do now. And I had breakfast with Ambassador Qinggang a couple days ago, and I pressed him on this point. And I hope he gets here quickly, because so we can have discussion with him on how on the best way to deal with the virus and new vaccines, and whether it's Sinovac or Western vaccines, because I think it's critical that we spend a lot more constructive time and effort to figure out how to deal with it.
I don't know if this is correct. My understanding is that the president did offer mRNA vaccines to the Chinese government, and that was not accepted. Which, I don't know if that's the case, but if that's true, it's hard to accept.
Well, from the get-go, we had people from the CDC that were at the embassy, and we're offering help, but they won't return the phone calls. So, from the get-go, when COVID started, we wanted to assist and provide help, but it didn't, we got no response. And that's not untypical of what happens when you have some kind of a disaster or difficult situation between our two countries. They tend to just clam up and not respond. And that was a great disappointment because I think, I think the other thing that I think the president at the time was very disappointed that he felt he was misled into believing they had things under control when indeed they didn't, and things became a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah. A poll came out this morning, which none of you would be surprised by, which had very negative views by the American population of China. I asked you, you had 60 seconds on CCTV. Let's assume you have 60 seconds to address the American people. And some of this, I think the previous panel talked about misunderstanding, which is partly, not entirely, which is partly the root of the problems in U.S.-China relations. So you have 60 seconds. And Terry, one of the things that was so interesting about this poll was Republicans are much more negative and hostile towards China than Democrats and independents. So you've got, let's say you're at a meeting of the RNC, you got 60 seconds. What do you say?
Well, I don't think you're going to turn them around in 60 seconds. I don't think you're going to turn anybody around in 60 seconds. But I would just talk about my personal experience with the Chinese people, going back to signing the sister state, hosting Xi Jinping, and he calls us old friends because we treated him so well, and say, yes, we have some real big differences with their policies and with their government, but we also need to recognize they are the second biggest economy in the world next to us, and they have a growing middle class. They need the safety and quality of American food. We need, and the American consumers want the quality and the affordability of the Chinese consumer goods. So let's work to try to avoid the ongoing conflict and look for opportunities to cooperate.
You couldn't do it in 60 seconds. Could you do it in 5 minutes?
I doubt it.
Well,
I don't think you're going to turn. Well, you got these opinions that have been built over a period of years.
So how do we turn this tide?
Well, I think you work at it day in and day out, and if we can get this reopened where we can have more trips back and forth, that's what I found really worked in Iowa, because of the sister state relationship, because of the number of Iowans that went to China, because of the number of Chinese students and Chinese people that came to our state. We became friends, and that built a level of trust. And obviously when you go years where things are closed down and you don't have those exchanges, it erodes some of that important relationship and trust that you need to have.
Max, you got an easier time. You're at the DNC, but you still only have 60 seconds.
No, I'm going to talk to the American people. First, I explained, having lived in China, the Chinese people are wonderful. They're just wonderful people. Just, I know what I'm talking about because I lived there, and just give examples and experiences and so forth. Second, this is a bit difficult, but I'd say stop watching Fox News. Fox News is terrible on this subject, and it just every news commentator has something negative to say about China. And then I try to say, I would say, it's hard to get this next point across. Unfortunately, most members of Congress are playing. First of all, Chinese policy in America is driven by domestic politics. it's the president, members of the House and Senate don't dare say anything positive about China. They get reelected by saying things negative about China, to be honest about it. And so I've tried to talk to a lot of members of Congress, including the administration. Hey, can't you lighten up a little bit here? Because this is important. We get along better together. It's very hard to do. But the more, and I say American people, remember that's what a lot of what you hear is being driven by domestic politics, and a lot of it's Fox News and other social media sites make it difficult. Kind of reminds me, my father said to me a long time ago, says, Max, don't believe everything you read, and only half of what you hear. And people, we don't have enough, we're losing our ability in America for critical thinking. We're too short-term in America, so we accept negative news more easily than we may have 30 years ago, and a lot of the negative stuff is about the U.S.-China relationship. Now that's a long answer, but I would just say, number one, try to shorten it. Say, look, Chinese people are wonderful. They're wonderful, believe me. And second, be careful of the sources where you get your news. Ask where you're getting your news. And it's hard to do this. I'll try not to be too philosophical about all this. But it kind of reminds me, what's the future of America? What's the future of America? I mean, countries and civilizations come and go in the sweep of history. Greeks, Romans, and so forth. So what's the future of the United States? There's no guarantee the United States is going to continue always big and who we are 1,000 years from now. There's no guarantee. So what are the things we can do to help prolong the United States growth and development? There are two things in my judgment. One is an educated electorate. You got to know what's going on. You can't just believe what the next person says. That's hard work. Democracy takes a lot of hard work. And to know what's going on, you got to dig into it and find out. Read newspapers and read them critically. Ask is that really right or is that not right? That's number one. The more and more people just think critically and get good information. By good, I mean just Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, South China Morning Post. Read it all. Find out what you believe in. That's condition number one. Condition number two is then do something about it. Don't just sit in your hind end. Stand up, say what you think and believe, because that's what democracy is. I know this is corny. We in government are just the hired hands. We're working for the people that elect us. And we need our marching orders from the people who elected us. And if the marching orders are good, by good I mean thoughtful, and they're going to tend to tell us what we should be doing, elect the right people and so forth. So anyway, I would say be a good citizen, read what's going on, trust your own instincts, don't just read what the next person says, and then I think that'll help the relationship a lot. And as has been said here, boy, once the quarantine's lifted, travel back and forth is going to help a lot.
What about visas and immigration? I think America to some degree has lost sight of the fact that we were built by immigrants. This city was built, we're sitting in Chicago, this city was built by immigrants. I live in New York City, city built by immigrants. The difficulties today, not only do we have a reduction of Chinese students in the United States, but the difficulty for some to stay. I was with the company that sets up offices in London because people can immigrate there more easily. So rather than bringing these people to New York or Chicago, the Indians and the Chinese are going to London. It breaks my heart when I hear that. I understand why they're making that decision, but we've lost sight of who built this country, and it's heartbreaking. This group in the audience are obviously, subsidiaries of Chinese companies. The U.S. government is the federal government is putting lots of barriers in the way for them to invest here, for them to operate here, for them to sell their products. What do you say to them about the future for those businesses in the United States?
Well, the first thing I would do is say be careful and abide by the laws and regulations so you don't get in trouble. And I would say that to the American businesses doing business in China as well. You need to recognize the laws and regulations, and you've got to live by it whether you like it or not. That's critically important. And obviously, because of the mistreatment of the Uyghurs, there's been significant legislation involving Xinjiang. You've got to be careful to make sure you're not using labor that is restricted because of the legislation. And so those kinds of things. I just think Max said he was elected 18 times, both primaries and general elections. I was elected 20 times. But I served in state government, not in the U.S. Senate. But I found that Iowans like their leaders to be humble and hardworking and accessible and available to the people. And so as governor, I went to every county every year. And it was a great way to really hear directly from people what they really thought. And when I went to China, I wanted to do exactly what Max did and go to every province. And I got to 26 of them before COVID shut it down. But the other thing that I think we need to know on the Chinese side is a lot of their policies are driven by domestic situations as well. And so, you know, the Chinese Communist Party controlled the education system, they control the media, and so they can feed the Chinese public what they want. Now, I think, you know, that's a challenge, just as we have a public opinion in this country which is pretty negative towards China at this time, but that could change. And I think it's part of our duty to do what we can to explain the relationship that we've had with the Chinese people and the kind of quality people they are, their work ethic, their commitment to education, and why we think we have a lot in common. And we are independent, we are interdependent of each other, and we need to recognize that, because if we don't, I think the whole world suffers.
Max, to the people in this room.
What's the question again?
The question is, these are people who work for subsidiaries of Chinese companies. Obviously, we have state government officials also. So what's the message? And they're running into lots of problems. And it's not a question of, Terry, they are complying with the law. The problem is the law is changing.
That's right.
It's regularly changing and becoming more restrictive. So
Well, but you got to live with that. You got to live with that.
Well,
Whether you like it or not, you got to live with the changes in the law, because if you don't, they may decide to target you. And I try to advise.
Nobody is talking about violating the law. That's not.
Sometimes
as the law changes, the question is, what message do you give to the people in this room? I mean, people have choices. Go home. Go to the UK, go to Germany, go to Italy, go to places where these restrictions don't exist. So the question is, what is the message that you give to this group?
Well, I think the laws are changing in those other countries as well. So there's no easy answer to this, but I do think it's critically important to give people the best, most accurate advice possible so they can succeed.
Sure.
And many Chinese companies are doing a great job. We have one, Syngenta, that serves Iowa. We had a candidate for Congress who won, but he was bitterly attacked, saying that he was supporting Xi Jinping because he got the endorsement and support of Syngenta. Syngenta is a company that provides important supplies for farmers. But that was the situation. And that person just happened to be a Republican who was being attacked by an incumbent Democratic Congressperson. person. So, and it happened on both sides, and we saw it in this last election, and I find that to be abhorrent, but we've got to try to get the facts out to people. And we need to recognize that there are many companies. And, you know, one of the things I did as governor, I traveled the world to attract companies from all over
To Iowa, right?
to Iowa, and also to sell Iowa products in those countries. And one of the reasons why we established that sister state in China, because we knew this is a big country, it's changing, and there may be someday a great market there, and it's there. And we need to never forget that or the wonderful people that we have become friends with.
Max.
Three things. First, I'd suggest, and Terry would like this, focus on states. Go to the governors, go to the legislatures, find some states where you can really do business, and because states want you much more than do the feds. The states want you, they want jobs, and they want you, so really focus on states. Second, we got to do the best we can at all levels that we operate in. It's your colleagues, your associates, whatever it is, just, we have no choice. You got to keep trying. You got to do the very best we can. And I think that's critical. Third, this too shall pass. I think that we're in a period now, a couple, 3 years, that after this period's over, then things are going to start to lighten up. And I say that because I think that the time's going to come, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is going to realize, hey, we have to deal with China. We just can't keep criticizing. We can't be doing all the stuff that we're doing. And beyond, I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have to realize that we can't let national security get in the way of progress. Clearly, each country has to protect its own national security. But when I was serving over there, my God, Eric Snowden revelation came out, and holy mackerel, the Chinese government passed all these national security statutes to protect their national security, as they should, but also statutes to protect their companies more than they should. And we are doing the same thing in America. Our national security statutes are too far. They're doing more than just protecting U.S. national security. They're also protecting American companies. So I think that we're going through a period, and a couple of years from now, maybe after the next election, 24 presidential election, will be the period in this relationship which I think is going to be more positive. Why? Because it has to. We have no other choice. It just has to be better. And that, maybe I'm naive, but I think that's going to be recognized.
I would agree with Max. I think states are very more interested in this. Governor Snyder, I think, was on a panel earlier today. I think he went to China every year that he was governor of Michigan.
Yeah.
And many other governors have done that with significant success in attracting investments, not just from China. I went to Japan a lot of times. I went to South Korea. I went to Europe and was successful in all of those locations to attract jobs. China, today, China is a wealthy, successful country with a lot of companies that want to invest. And we, as governors, are the ones that need to lead that effort. So, of course, I think the best leaders are people that have been the chief executive of their states. Because they have had to answer the tough questions.
Of course.
And they have been on the front lines of that. It's easy if you're in Congress to say something, but you don't have to do anything. But if you're the governor, people want to know, what are you doing? What are you doing to create jobs? What are you doing to make life better for the people of your state? And that's the reason why I'm very partial to governors. But I also think that governors and local officials are the key ones to rebuild this relationship.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Terry is right. You need good lawyers, accountants, consultants to deal with the evolving regulatory situation, and it is getting worse. I think both Max and Terry are right that state and local governments, as we heard in the panel, not the previous panel, the panel before that, state and local governments want that investment. And to some degree, our federal government has lost sight of the job creation activities when Chinese companies invest. That it's, you know, I think John Holden made reference to, we study Chinese investment in the United States by congressional district. So we literally, 435 congressional districts, we look at how much Chinese investment is in each district, and then we extrapolate from that the employment numbers. And it is significant. And as Max put it, you know, we can't make everything a national security issue. If we do, then employment in the United States is going to have a lot more trouble than it does currently. So let me just, somebody's holding up a sign. We've got 1 minute, so let me give Terry and Max one last comment.
Just to say that I'm glad you're all here. I think we need to continue to look for opportunities for cooperation and collaboration, and look at ways that we individually can make a difference in this relationship. We're the two biggest economies in the world. We need to find ways to work together for the benefit of our people and for the benefit of the entire world.
Can't beat that.
I want to thank, I want to,
I will suggest this.
yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how the Chinese American community can have a greater impact in American policy. I know many of you are aware of APAC, American Israeli Committee. They raise a ton of money, and they give a ton of money to members of the House and the Senate, and they're listened to by members of the House and the Senate. Now, I'm not saying there's a quid pro quo here, but I am suggesting that the Chinese American community in America give a lot of thought to how to get organized. Leaders should talk among themselves. There are lots of ways to do it, but we know it's important to work with states, but there is a presidential election coming up. Presidents are pretty important here, as are members of the House and the Senate. So I strongly urge you, strongly, spend the extra, don't forget about some other things you're doing. Figure out some way how to organize in a way that's effective to help achieve your goals.
Join me in thanking two great American public servants.
Thank you, Steve.
A lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you all for those wonderful insights.